Welcome from the University of St Andrews, alumni, colleagues and friends across the globe. I'm Gavin Rennie, Alumni Relations Manager, and I'm delighted to be your host for this next instalment of our Saints Talk series delivered by Professor Anthony Lang from the School of International Relations. Professor Lang is a leading scholar in global political theory, currently serving as Professor of International Political Theory at the University of St Andrews, and as Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of International Political Theory. His research explores the intersection of politics, law, and ethics, focusing on themes such as global constitutionalism, human rights, and the ethics of war and international responsibility. After receiving his BA in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame and his MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University, Professor Lang held roles at the American University in Cairo, the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, and taught at several institutions, including Yale University and Bard College. Since joining the university in 2004, he's founded the Center for Global Constitutionalism and later served as head of the School of International Relations. In this evening's talk, Peace, the Evolution of a Universal Value, Professor Lang will draw on examples from world politics to answer key questions about peace. Is peace a universal value, one that stretches from our own personal lives through our cultures and political systems? How has the idea of peace evolved through time? And ultimately, is peace possible today? Following the talk, attendees can ask questions in a live question and answer. Simply put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. Thank you. Tony.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and thanks to the whole development team for putting this together. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your questions after I present this. And actually, this is a benefit to me as well because this is a first step in a book I'm trying to write, so it actually forced me to put some of my thoughts together. So I'm really pleased to be able to speak with you all today about the question of universal values and peace. So in my talk, I'll try to take about 30 minutes or so we have plenty of time for questions here. I'm going to have kind of three parts to the talk. The first will introduce you to this bigger question of, are there universal values and what do we mean by that? And can we even talk about that in today's world, which is so full of conflicting ideas and questions? Secondly, I'll turn to this particular topic of peace, which of course is something that we seem to be missing quite a bit today with the numerous wars going on and violence everywhere around us. And then the third part, I'm going to turn to the kind of concrete way I'm going to try to deal with this, at least in this presentation, and then eventually in the book I'm going to write. And that's to turn to a particular individual, in this case, former Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Boutros-Ghali. So let me jump into it right now and first start with the idea of what are universal values. And these are the kind of four key questions that are at the beginning and will be going throughout the book I'm going to be writing over the next couple of years. And they seem like, in some ways, maybe obvious questions to some of you, or maybe the answers might seem obvious. So some people might say, of course, there's universal values. We all live by them. But there's obviously lots of divergent religious, philosophical, political agendas in the world today that would challenge the idea of any kind of universality. So I think that even the question, are there universal values, is a really important one. The second part of the book is going to deal with the question of where do these come from? We sometimes think, I'll use the analogy of the Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments, that come on out of this kind of singular idea that this is what all universal values are and they never change. I'm thinking of the Judeo-Christian tradition there, of course. But I think they come and they change and they evolve. And that's part of this project, is to look at how these values evolve over time. And that leads to the third point. Can they change? And I do think they can change. And I think it's important for us to recognize the ways in which they change and actually try to highlight locations, both in the international system and maybe in our own lives, in our own countries, where those changes take place and try to map them on. And there's some really interesting research going on now in the field of international relations that tries to address this. And then last, is that if these things are changing all the time, what is their foundation? Excuse me. What is their foundation? How can we have something that evolves and yet has a foundation? And I try to negotiate this space a little bit. I think there's a core to every one of the values I'm going to be looking at. But at the same time, I think they do evolve and they do change. So that's kind of the puzzle, so to speak, that I'm dealing with in this book. So let me turn to there's two philosophers for me that really capture how I generally approach this. But I'm going to give a little bit of a caution with both of these people. Hopefully you've heard of the first one, Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates. So there's this very rich tradition in ancient Greece of philosophy. And over the years, I've written quite a bit about Aristotle. I think he's a fascinating figure. And the reason I picked the term values is really from Aristotle. Because many people, when we think of ethical questions or normative questions, they think it's either a set of rules we have to follow or we just focus on consequences. I think what Aristotle does for us is he points that ethics is really about what we value. Now, he used the term virtue, arete in ancient Greece, but I'm going to use the word value because it really helps us think about ethics are not divorced from what we care about. Ethics are actually about what we care about and how we enact the things we care about. But that shouldn't be just individually, everybody wants to pursue their own thing. Aristotle also was very interested in what is it that constitutes the human being. And he felt that there were two things that differentiate us from the rest of the world. That is, we think and we live together in formal communities. And as a result, he came up with what he called the intellectual virtues and the practical virtues. And to me, that's what's at the core of our understanding of what values should be. They're really kind of at this particular place where we're trying to think out loud and we're trying to live together. And to me, Aristotle gives us some ways we can maybe think about this. Now, the third bullet point you can see on my screen there is Aristotle was not perfect, certainly, as no thinker is. And one of the problems with Aristotle is he justified slavery in a lot of his work, in some of his work, and sexism. And this was based on his conception of the human person, which was based on his notions of biology, which were flawed. So I'm going to come back to why this is important. I think Aristotle is very important, and he frames the way I want to think about things, but he's also problematic, and that problematic is something I'm trying to address in this work. The other thinker who helps orient my work on this, maybe less familiar to some of you, it was the Dutch lawyer, philosopher, intellectual Hugo Grotius, who lived from 1583 to 1645. And he's often seen as the father of international law. He was a child prodigy. He wrote verse in Latin and Greek when he was like 8 years old. But he was really well known for articulating at a key moment in the development of the European international system a way of seeing international law that was different, and really helping to create what we understand as international law, drawing on a whole range of what he understood as the natural law tradition, drawing on history, drawing on philosophy, drawing on religion, to develop what he understood to be universal values for the global level. Now, just as Aristotle was not perfect, Grotius was not perfect either. He was intimately involved in the Dutch East Indies Company, which, as the name suggests, was the way the Netherlands was extending its empire throughout the world, in particular into the Indies, today modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia region. So he was very much involved with that effort. For him, that was not a problem, but for us, it is a problem. And for me, it is a problem today. So I think it's important that we recognize that both these thinkers who inform the way I approach these questions have problems within their heritage and within how they approach the normative agendas that they had. So how do I deal with this? Well, the project is in fact going to look at how universal values are articulated, promoted, and developed and evolve through particular figures from what I'm going to call the global south. Used to be called the third world, can be called lots of different things. And these are figures who've been really very important. So the way I'm going to write this book is I'm going to have a theoretical section to each chapter, and then I'll use these different figures and what they did in their role as a way to think about the particular values that they're advancing. So let me just give you a quick overview of these few people. First, as I mentioned, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, former Secretary General of the United Nations. I'm going to say more about him in a minute, so I won't go into him. The second, the universal value of justice. Fetwa Bensouda is no longer, but was the previous prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. The question of rights, I'm going to look at Navi Pillay, who was a High Commissioner for Human Rights. She is still a South African jurist. When it comes to law, I'm going to look at this guy, George Abisab, who was very important. He didn't play a role within any one of the key institutions, but he helped formulate the protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which are the kind of laws of war that we have today. And he's an Egyptian international lawyer. When it comes to equality, I'm going to turn to this person, Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is the current head of the World Health Organization. And I'm using, while I could make this a question about health, I think equality is better because the WHO has tried to advance health equality around the world. So I think he's a very interesting figure here. Now, I've got 4 other possible values that I might look at: community, belief, truth, and even beauty. I'm not sure if can find the right people or find the right frame for these. I've only got, the 5 I've got up here so far. But it's a work in progress, and the book is coming along. So we'll see if I can locate these other values in some way. So that's the book, and that's the bigger project about universal values. And I'm happy to answer questions about that when we turn to the question and answer. Let me turn to the second part of the talk, which is the focus on peace. Now, peace, in some way, is obvious, in some way, is difficult. So peace, I would argue, is a value that's at the heart of the human condition. We can't really do anything unless we have some conception of peace. I'm not going to talk about him, but the famous English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that the peace is the central condition of any political community. And he was writing in the midst of the British Civil War, so he knew what he was talking about. But I think it's also interesting to start with the way theistic and non-theistic religious traditions place peace at their very center. So I've got, it's easy to find images online. I've got a couple images here from Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. I think every one of these traditions of thought puts peace front and center. Now, it's sometimes hard to see that, of course, because religious traditions often are used to justify conflict and violence. And so we don't want to, lessen that. However, it is important to note that every one of these religious traditions puts peace at its very center. And I think we can't forget that when we're thinking about peace. And importantly as well, the third point there, peace is both an interstate and a community goal. And that's what makes it difficult sometimes to understand and to grapple with. So, of course, we all want the famous inner peace. We want inner peace. And there's something as human beings we would like to achieve. I'm going to be less focused on that, although I'll connect it up a bit with some of the ideas I'll develop in the chapter, in the book. But I'm more probably interested in the idea of peace as a community goal, something that we need as both a domestic community, but then as an international community. So again, peace in some way, it's an obvious principle, obvious value, but it's also a complicated one. And let me turn then to the United Nations. Or international institutions and international law, I should say. So peace, now this may seem ironic to many, especially if you read the news every day. We don't get a lot of news about peace. We get mainly news in international affairs about war, which I'm not going to deny, and certainly we can talk about that in the question and answer. But peace is at the heart of international law and international institutions, and I think we sometimes forget that, to our peril. International law I mentioned Grotius, who's considered this father back in the 17th century, but into the 18th, 19th, and certainly into the 20th century, international law was seen as a way to create peace between states. And I think it continues to be at the heart of how international lawyers understand what they're trying to do. And it's also central to international institutions. So I've got mentioned there the League of Nations to the United Nations, and the League of Nations worked for a short period, not very well. If you know the history, it kind of collapsed. It didn't kind of collapse, it did collapse during World War II. But then when the war was over, the United Nations comes into existence and other than while the Cold War was on, it maybe was less effective, but there was a period which I'm going to come to in a minute, when it was very effective, when it did do a lot, when it did change a number of things. I've even got there the European Union, and if you think, sometimes we think of the European Union through modern lenses of Brexit, et cetera, and other things. But if you remember, the European Union emerges at the only about 10 years after the end of World War II, and it had different names. It went through different iterations, but it really is surprising that you had this institution that came about, focused first on trade and just kind of very basic issues, not formally on security or peace, but peace was at the heart of those who brought the European Union together. French thinkers, German thinkers, British thinkers, who really worked hard to bring the European Union into existence. And to me, the European Union is an example of a successful institution in creating peace in a region. Again, not always perfect and lots of problems with both these institutions, but to me, they do really demonstrate what can be achieved through institutions. Now, I do want to acknowledge that peace is, again, not simple. And there has been within the academic literature and to some extent in the more public realm as well, a critique of what's sometimes called the liberal peace. Some of my former colleagues here, Oliver Richmond, Roger McGinty, and others, were really at the forefront of bringing this to the attention of the international community. And their argument was that peace agreements and peace institutions and structures are oftentimes for the powerful. They're not for the weak. They're not for the people that they're really supposed to be benefiting from peace. And peace was often imposed by international institutions on local conflicts. And even that peace is sometimes linked to neoliberal capitalism and the power of corporations. So their argument is, and there's a very robust literature on this that you can look up, they argued to turn to the local, that peace should reflect the interests of local populations, and that, moreover, the peace architecture, if we can call it that, in the international system needs to democratize and include more voices. And I take their critique very seriously because it's a really important one and a really beneficial one that helps us think about some of the problems with thinking of peace in a very broad and simplistic way. However, having said that, I think one of the things that's happened for some is that they then turn away from even trying to advance peace in any way. The local is complicated space. It's not an easy space to work within. And I think sometimes we, in our critiques as academics, and I do this myself, we undermine the very values we want to advance. And so I'm not saying my colleagues have done that or this literature does that, but I think we want to take the critique seriously, but then see where we can go with it and see how we can develop it further. So that's part of what I'm trying to do in this project. So now let me turn to the third part of what I want to say today, and that's to focus on this one individual who I think is a fascinating person, Boutros Boutros-Ghali. He was born in Egypt. He was actually a scholar, an international lawyer. He was trained in Paris and in Cairo, was an incredibly prolific writer and individual. I mean, looking at his output of what he wrote before he became involved in politics directly is just astonishing. I mean, as an academic that doesn't have to do any of that, I'm really jealous of what he was able to produce. So he was actually famous before he became the UN Secretary General. He played a key role in the presidency of the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, who helped to create the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt in the late 1970s that kind of came together in the Camp David Accords that U.S. President Jimmy Carter helped to bring these two countries together. And Egypt and Israel have had a cold peace for a long time. And sometimes people forget that actually they were very much enemies. And to see them as somehow creating a peaceful resolution to their conflict was a really astounding achievement. Now, Boutros Boutros-Ghali was in the foreign ministry, and he was kind of the acting foreign minister, so he played a role. It was really Anwar Sadat who really generated and pushed things forward. And at times, Boutros-Ghali had to hold him back because he was too enthusiastic. So he's got a great memoir of his time serving as Boutros-Ghali does, as in the foreign ministry there. And it's a really fascinating story to read. I have out there another point there. He's actually not Muslim, coming from Egypt. He's a member of the Coptic Christian community in Egypt. That's about 10%, I think, roughly, of the Egyptian population. And I put that there for two reasons. One is I think his values as a Christian informed how he approached both his role and in Egypt, and also when he became Secretary General. But also, some years ago, I actually had the opportunity to interview Boutros Boutros-Ghali because I wrote a chapter on him, which was part of an edited volume of people writing about the religious values of the Secretaries General of the United Nations. So I had a chance, as I said, to talk to Boutros-Ghali in person. He's a fascinating, very cultured person, and he spoke fluent in French, Arabic, English, plus other languages as well. So he was a brilliant individual. So he becomes, I'm sorry I don't have the dates here, he becomes Secretary General of the United Nations in 1991 and serves only one term until 1996, which has been rare. No other Secretary General has only served one term. They usually serve 2 5-year terms. And that's partly because, well, it is because of objections that he received from the United States, particularly the Clinton administration. He really did not, there was a real conflict between them. And over time, that conflict led to the United States refusing to confirm him for a second term. And what was the difficulty that he advanced to the United States? Well, if you remember, 1991-92, the end of the Cold War, the Clinton administration comes to office, a moment of great enthusiasm, great excitement. Things are going to change, new things are going to happen. And Boutros Boutros-Ghali, really took that seriously. And he introduced the idea of peacekeeping. Well, the UN had already had peacekeeping, but wanted to strengthen peacekeeping and introduce what he called the Department of Political Affairs, which gave the United Nations a stronger intelligence gathering capacity. So he did things to really make the UN much more effective in the international community. And that was something that at first the Clinton administration embraced, but due to a number of problems over time, didn't go very well. So he kind of represents the difficulty of trying to be in this non-political office, this diplomatic office, and yet at the same time advancing the goal, various goals, not just the goal of peace. So I'm going to focus on just one aspect of what he tried to do. So one of the first tasks he was given by the Security Council, they asked him to come up with some proposals about how to strengthen peacekeeping in the international system. So he wrote this Agenda for Peace in 1992, and then he added a supplement to the Agenda for Peace in 1995. And as I said, at the end of the Cold War, there was great enthusiasm for this. It was a very exciting moment. There was an attempt to really change things. The UN had peacekeeping as part of what it did. It's actually not in the charter in a formal way. It was actually something that was created as a result of the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, when the UN put a force between the Israelis and the Egyptians to help bring about a kind of ceasefire process. So peacekeeping was very much something that was about simply putting UN troops between warring parties. But Boutros Boutros-Ghali tried to advance this more, and he focused a bit more on peacemaking and what he called peace building, and even more controversially, peace enforcement. So peace enforcement was the idea that you can create new agendas, and you can actually use force, ironically, to enforce peace if it's necessary. And this is what got him into some trouble, along with various other actors in the international system. So I've got 3 countries listed there, with 2 countries in a region. So Somalia, you may remember, there was a humanitarian intervention in Somalia before Boutros Boutros-Ghali came to power, but as he came to power, there was a conflict between the United States and the United Nations about who controlled the forces there, which led to the forces being withdrawn after a conflict. Rwanda, unfortunately, peacekeeping wasn't employed there, and Boutros Boutros-Ghali claims very much that it was the fault of the great powers, the veto powers in the Security Council, who refused to send troops. And I think most people would agree that that was the case. And then the Balkans region, the former Yugoslavia, you had these conflicts going on, and there was a number of conflicts between the UN, particularly Boutros Boutros-Ghali, NATO, and the various powers like the United States, Russia, at the time, who had different agendas. And these conflicts were horrible things that happened, obviously, but they also really undermined Boutros Boutros-Ghali's attempts to advance this peacekeeping agenda. However, he didn't, even though he was faced with these problems, he didn't give up on them. And he actually did something more creative, in my view, and this is something I'd like to focus on in what I'm going to write about him. He argued that peace can't be disconnected from other things in the international system. And sometimes we think of peace as a singular idea, even the way I've been presenting it comes across as a singular idea. But he actually issued two other agenda documents. One is the Agenda for Development, and the second is the Agenda for Democratization. And these were attempts to link, he continued to argue that you can't have peace without development and democratization. Now, development has in some ways become a bad word. It was, again, maybe linked to that critique of the liberal peace, an attempt to impose particular neoliberal capitalist agendas on the international system, on countries that maybe aren't ready for them. The notion of democratization is complicated too, of course. But Boutros Boutros-Ghali was a firm believer that you cannot have development, you can't have peace without development and democratization. So you need to see it in this holistic sense. And this, I think, reflects the fact that Boutros Boutros-Ghali was one of the few, I think he's one of the few academics who has served at the post of Secretary General. He really took a theoretical approach to these questions, but hopefully, like we all try to do working in the field of politics, try to connect that academic approach to really concrete agendas, which he did do. Now, the UN system still has peacekeeping, and peacekeeping, however, they have become much less popular, not just in the recent, I guess, current global order, but really starting in sometime in the mid-2000s, you had a certain amount of resistance from the great powers, that includes the United States. You had problems of peacekeepers themselves. There was, unfortunately, accusations of abuse by peacekeepers against local populations. And sometimes the peacekeepers themselves were being drawn from countries which need funding rather than have robust traditions of peacekeeping. And the notion of peace enforcement has largely, as I said, kind of gone away in many ways, and that's, I think, really unfortunate. It is one of these things that I think we need much more of, and I think it's something that can be resurrected in a way. I think it needs a new recasting, and I've got some ideas about that, which we could talk about in the Q&A if you'd like. So it's still part of the UN system, and it is still necessary. But it does need to be rethought, exactly in the way that Boutros Boutros-Ghali tried to do. So let me finish on this slide here. So in his inaugural address, when he became Secretary General of the United Nations, he said he wanted to be a realist in a utopian city. And I think that's a beautiful phrase. What he was saying is, if you know international relations, to be realist or to be realistic means, you have to take seriously conflicts and power and national interests. But he did believe very much in international law, international institutions, and in the United Nations as a place where you could create some versions of liberal ideals or utopian ideals. And to me, that really captures what he tried to do. And for me, I'll take us back to Aristotle for a minute. He embodied the Aristotelian virtues. So he was, as an academic, advancing the intellectual virtues, the virtue of knowledge. And he thought very hard about how peace needs to link with development, needs to link with democracy. And as I said, he then, in terms of the practical virtues, needed to put those things into action by creating new institutions, even when he saw that this was not going to benefit him when it came to continuing in his role as the Secretary General. And he did want to continue with it. His book, which I've just finished, is called Unvanquished. I'm not sure if you can see that, but I can show it again. And he was somewhat of a prickly character, I think. So I don't want to deny that he didn't have his faults. He was not a perfect person. But at the same time, he had the courage to act, even when he knew it would be unpopular. I was just reading today in one passage where his staff was telling him, you need to back off on some of these agendas. You're never going to get reelected. And he said, I'm 74 years old. If I don't get reelected, it's okay. I want to be, but I know that this is what I have to do. So courage is one of these virtues, one of the practical virtues that Aristotle reminds us is so important. So to me, we need more people like Boutros Boutros-Ghali. We need people who come from the global South, as I said, people who have been probably more subject to the imposition of values than they had in terms of articulating them. And yet at the same time, someone who wants to take those values and wants to reshape them in a way that will make the international system and all of our lives better in some way. Now, what that looks like now, I'm not 100% sure. I have some ideas about how we can kind of resuscitate the idea of peace and peacekeeping. And I do think we need to continually not forget the role of the United Nations in the international system. So while I say we need more like him, maybe we need more like his ideals. So I don't want to say we need another Boutros Boutros-Ghali, although, as I said, I have a great deal of respect for him. So that's my presentation on some of the questions I have here. And I hope you found that interesting. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So.
Thanks, Tony. That was really enjoyable. Thank you so much. I must say the whole concept of peace enforcement, peacemaking. I know it's in a different concept, in a different environment, but I'll be really honest. As a parent of two boys, peace enforcement is definitely a tactic I employ on a daily, weekly basis. So it resonates with me. Although obviously a completely different scale. I totally appreciate that. But I'm interested, if I may, just kick us off with a question.
Sure.
Do you feel peace is a universal value if there's so much war in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gavin. And I think that is, the kind of center of what I'm trying to do is trying to figure out how we can, as I said, resurrect some of these ideas of peacekeeping and think creatively about how we can have peacekeeping. So let me give you an example. So President of the United States, President Donald Trump, has created something called a Board of Peace, a new institution, which was initially just going to be about Gaza and the Palestinian question and the international problems around that, but it's kind of morphed into something slightly bigger, and he's got lots of countries that have come aboard. Now, at first, it seemed like it was going to be a replacement for the United Nations, but in fact, he has said explicitly, no, we can work with the UN, and we want to work with the UN. And I think even, to get Donald Trump to admit that he's going to work with the UN is a good starting point. So yeah, it's definitely difficult. I would much rather see a UN blue helmets. That is, they wear the blue helmets. That's how they stand outside of normal military forces. I would much rather say blue helmets in all the kind of conflicts we're seeing in the world, intervening, not without, of course, you need a starting point. So you need the two sides to agree that, to at least to a ceasefire. But, for instance, right now in the Strait of Hormuz, we've got this conflict between the U.S. and the United States and Israel. What would it look like to have peacekeepers on boats doing the attempt to keep the Strait of Hormuz open? I know that sounds very idealistic, and I'm not on the ground. I'm not a military officer, so I don't know exactly how that would look like. But I do think we have to keep remembering that the UN is there, and we have to keep coming up with ways that the UN can play a role in some of these conflicts. Sometimes it's not going to work, and it certainly didn't work with the history of peacekeeping always. But to me, I think there is that. Now, let me go back to the more philosophical side of your question: is if people keep going to war, does that mean that their peace is actually a value that people value? To me, my answer to that is always like, well, people break laws all the time, but that doesn't mean we're going to give up on the legal code, right? I drive too fast. That doesn't mean I don't want speed limits on the roads. And I think the value is there. And I think if you ask anybody, of course, they want peace in their life and in their community. And we just have to try to think about how we can get it at the global level. So that would be my thought on that.
Great, Tony. Thank you. I think kind of in addition to that, there's a question from Alison that's come in. If I can just share that as well.
Sure.
Alison asks, you're emphasizing the importance of peace, but artistic flourishing is often fueled by conflict. So examples such as World War I, poetry and the Italian Renaissance, which took place in the midst of ongoing turbulence, but are now valued collectively as important societal connectors. Do you have any kind of thoughts or comments on that?
That's a great question. I mean, that's a complicated one. You have, I was thinking of when you were saying that question, there's the famous, beautiful painting by Goya, where the Spanish soldiers or the Spanish rebels being shot by Napoleonic troops, I think, which is a striking image. And you do have art and music and all sorts of things that come out of conflict, even war, right? Um, I get, and peace can also be boring in that sense too. Like, you just sit around and play harps all day. That doesn't seem like a very exciting life. But I guess to me, in the end, I would much rather have less killing and wounding, even if that meant our art had to change or our music had to change somehow. So I completely acknowledge it's a tricky one, and there's been some incredible art that has come out of war and conflict and et cetera. But I guess my thought would be I want to advance an idea of peace, maybe over some of those, maybe not in place of, but instead of those would be my thought.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tony. So then in terms of, you touched on the UN as well, as towards the end of your presentation. Do you feel that the UN's too idealistic of an institution in the modern world?
Yeah, it's tricky, I think. I mean, the UN is definitely idealistic, and that's, the principles on which it's based are idealistic ones. Because it's not only peace, as I'll try to develop throughout the book, it's human rights, it's all sorts of things that are idealistic. I think one of the things that we as scholars need to try to do more of is to convince people who are realists that there is a real benefit to these ideals. And I think sometimes we kind of fall back on, and certainly scholars in my field, international relations or political science, they want to be seen as tough and realistic, and they want to be clear that they're taking seriously the problems of the world, et cetera, and which we should. I mean, I want to be considered like I'm taking seriously the problems of the world too. But if that means giving up on our ideals, I'm not sure life is really that worth living, to be honest. I mean, why wouldn't we try to be idealistic? And the UN is a great example of a realistic utopia, as Boutros Boutros-Ghali said, because so I'll just give a quick little history story here. The League of Nations collapsed in many ways because there wasn't a role for the most powerful states that was different than the rest of the international community. So that meant that and they needed unanimity to do anything, so that nothing really was able to be done. Now, when the UN was created, as you may know, the Security Council has the 5 permanent members who have a veto power: the United States, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and China. And those 5 states obviously have been given a different position. So that's a more reflection of realism that's built into the United Nations. Now, is that truly reflective of the international system today? Should France and the United Kingdom have a seat in the way that they do?
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure about that.
Yeah.
Maybe one should go to India, maybe, et cetera. There's other countries that maybe have more influence in the system. So to be realistic today, we would actually want to include maybe other states in that role. But that's only to say that I think international institutions reflect both that idealism and a certain level of realism. And we kind of need both. But I want to keep reminding people that there are these idealistic goals. We've got ideals that we should seek to advance. So that would be my thought on that one.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Tony. I've had another question in, which starts by saying thank you for the stimulating talk. I'd just like to know your thoughts on the inclusion of women in peace building. If we look at the local, we see women who are not included in IR conversations about peace. Was it Cynthia Enloe who said peace cannot be achieved and maintained if women continue to be marginalized and their contributions ignored?
A great question. And I think really, and I love the reference to Cynthia Enloe, who's a good friend of mine and who this university gave an honorary degree to some years ago. Was it last year? I can't remember now. No, I can't remember when we gave her the honorary degree. But she's been one of the leading scholars of feminist international relations theory, and has really, I think, helped to remind. She always says, "Look where the women are, and look what the women are doing, and how important they are." So that is one of the really beneficial things about the turn to local peace that I mentioned, that critique of the liberal peace. the turn to the local was to take seriously the way oftentimes women in conflict societies were organizing, were seeking to advance their agendas, were seeking to promote, not just for themselves as selfishly, but to create change in their society that would lead to more peace. Now, I think we should celebrate that, and I think one of the things we should do is enable international institutions like the UN to support those agendas. So there's a whole body of work called Women in Peace and Security, that's both a scholarly and an intellectual approach, that seeks to develop uh, those kind of roles for women and try to advance how they can help contribute to what we're doing in the international system. So I think definitely we need to look at the local. And to be honest, one of the problems with the United Nations is it's only had male secretaries general. And I think that's a big problem, that there isn't a place at the top of that organization for women. And my hope is that after the tenure of the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that the next person will be a woman, which again, you can't just, as feminist scholars say, don't just add women and stir. It has to be a deeper agenda and change. But I definitely think that would certainly help give a signal to the international community around these questions. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I've got another question here from Adina and Alexandros. Have you considered the dimension of trauma, especially collective trauma, when it comes to the possibility of peace? And how do you think a trauma-informed approach would look like in international relations with respect to the topic of peace?
That's a great question, and I know those two questioners. It's a difficult one for sure, because trauma is not just what we as individuals experience. It's something that communities experience, and that it kind of hangs over them in many ways for a long time. What's really kind of, in international relations, we say it's interesting, even though it's terrible. You have even countries, so I can remember when the Balkans wars were going on, Serbia, which wanted to hold Yugoslavia together, all sorts of complications. But Serbia would kind of celebrate its past of a medieval loss to the Ottoman Empire. So there's interesting ways in which trauma functions sometimes when it comes to war and violence. Sometimes countries will take a traumatic history and they'll try to turn it into something that changes and makes something different, in a good way. So I think, for instance, Germany has dealt with the trauma of the Holocaust in its own way and tried to advance new ways of thinking about its engagement in the world since World War II. You have other countries, that maybe take a more negative route from that trauma. But certainly trauma is something that we need to think about when it comes to the attempts to advance peace. And it's not easy. And I don't have the easy answer to that. I think one of the complicated things is trauma originates as a personal psychological experience, but then gets extrapolated onto countries, as I just did there. It's obviously not the same dynamic. There's something different going on between individuals and countries, and how we understand what they're doing. So I think that's important to recognize too. So that would be one thought on the trauma. But it's a great question. It's something I think people need to think more about and try to develop new ideas around.
Thank you, Tony. Another question's come in from Isaac, who asks, do you think you could make a distinction between a value that is mostly an experience, say peace, and a related value that is a more behavioral, so non-violence, ahimsa? Does this distinction play a role in your theoretical, practical framework? Has the value peace evolved in relation to the value non-violence, especially considering the prominence of the latter in 20th century socio-political movements?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Ahisma, the in the question, the topic, that's from the Hindu tradition, something that Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, tried to advance in his thinking about peace and nonviolence. So the difference between an experience and a behavior, that's a good question. I'd have to think more about how they relate to each other. So for me, I think I see them as interrelated, kind of intimately interrelated. I'm not sure I would keep them that separate, I guess. I
Okay.
would say that they're a state of experience and a behavior are things that we want to see going together in an obvious way. I guess, yeah, if you value peace maybe as an experience, how you get to it is, of course, the big question. So that's maybe I'm going to be focused more on behaviors in the work that I'm going to be doing in this project. So as example, Boutros Boutros-Ghali valued peace just like anybody, but he wanted to put in place new institutions and structures through the UN to achieve that. So new behaviors for that institution, if I can put it that way. So I think that's interesting to think about. I don't, again, I'm not, it would be worth kind of, I haven't thought enough about how those two
Sure.
terms, behavior and experience, relate to each other. But it's a good question, though.
Yeah.
Good question.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question's come in. It says, alongside development and democracy, in the 90s, there was a presumption that justice was also a requirement of peace. But post ICC, do we still believe justice and peace go together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the idea that so I think underlying that question is the notion that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has kind of undermined in some strange way the attempt to achieve justice, in the sense that it hasn't always been as successful in prosecuting those who it indicts, right? And originally, the problem with the ICC is that it was only indicting and then trying people from Africa, and not even leaders, but members of militias or leaders of militia groups. I think that's changed a bit, and the ICC has developed like any institution. It did obviously indict Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, so individuals who are seen as committing war crimes or crimes against humanity. And I think that's, whether or not those people will ever go on trial in the Netherlands is, I think, unlikely. But that's okay. I mean, I think that's not necessarily a problem. But to go back to the question about justice emerging at the same time as development and democratization, the ICC comes out of the Rome Statute, which was a big conference, the Rome Conference in 1998, and then comes into existence in 2002. So it did emerge at that same time, the belief that we can use institutions like the ICC to create peace in the international system. So I think that is actually a really good thing. That we have an ICC. I think the ICC is obviously problematic and it's not perfect and it's going through growing pains. It's not that old when you think of other international institutions. But I think it does move us inch by inch toward a greater form of international justice. The other thing that people sometimes forget about the ICC is famously the first prosecutor, Luis Macampo, said that his goal is for the ICC to go out of business. And by that, he meant the ICC is not just prosecuting people who commit these crimes. It's helping countries develop their own judiciaries. So it's not like a cosmopolitan vision of a single world order. It's actually an attempt to ensure that justice is done either at the local, domestic, or national or international levels. So I think we sometimes ignore, and even Boutros Boutros-Ghali, just to jump back to him for a minute, was very insistent that the United Nations is a place where the state should be reinforced. It's not a cosmopolitan institution. It's a place where we can create peace, justice, rights by working with states, not by ignoring them or discarding them. So I think the ICC is a good example of an attempt to do that. Again, problematic, but I think it's at least a small attempt.
And just a very quick follow-up question
Sure.
around the ICC. How important can the ICC be if there are some countries initiating wars who aren't members or haven't signed up to the ICC?
Yeah, very important. And so it's somewhat complicated. You can actually indict people. So the way Vladimir Putin was indicted, for instance, Ukraine is a member of the ICC, and because the claim is that the crimes were committed in Ukraine, even though Russia is not a member, he could be indicted. So there's different ways in which individuals can be brought before the court, or indicted and then hopefully brought before the court to have their day in court. The bigger problem probably is enforcement and how you enforce judgments that are made by the ICC. There is some states that will if somebody who's indicted ends up in their territory, they will send them to the ICC. So there are states that do believe it, and they're not the weakest states in the world. You know, the countries like Great Britain or the United Kingdom and France, etc., they would do this if they could. So I think it is definitely one of the problems with because, you know, the great powers, Russia, China, United States, they're not members. There was a time when the United States, actually under the administration of George W. Bush, tried to say that anybody who was working for the ICC would be arrested if they were involved in anything in the United States. So that kind of weakens the institution, certainly. But I think we shouldn't give up on it. We should keep trying to find ways we can support it and seek it to develop better.
Yep, yep. Thank you. I've got another question from another one of your former students who's joined us this evening, Tony.
Okay.
Samir Arab says, I was your student from 2006 to 2011. Graduated from the LIT IPT program. Glad to see your research still encompasses peace and the Middle East. My question is, what is the purpose of a virtue of peace that cannot be enforced other than through force? Which you touched on in your presentation. How do you enforce peace through the application of violence? Isn't it itself a bit of an oxymoron? Isn't this might makes right dressed up to appear virtuous? Greetings from Montana.
Yeah, great question. Really good to see my former students thinking hard about these.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you're not supposed to challenge me about it. They're, you know, ask somebody else that. No, I'm kidding. It's a really great question, and you know, this is why I think Boutros Ghali is a really great example, right? So he's trying to promote during his tenure. He tried to promote a new way of understanding peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and really tried to develop this in a different way, which meant including violence.
They want to undo front clips on the.
Sorry about that. That was somebody else. I think one of the things that's interesting is that he's not somebody that this was going to help. Like, he wasn't doing this from a position of power to impose the UN's power or his own power or anything like that. I think he's a good example of someone that tries to bring together people, and he does recognize, as I think I would and anybody else would, there are going to be times when people are going to fight with each other. As you said, Gavin, you've got kids. You know, sometimes to get kids to do it, I mean, we're not talking about peace enforcement with our children. I mean, I've got 4 children, you know, but there is a way that you do have to kind of use subtle forms of coercion as a parent and maybe more formal forms of coercion when you're in an international institution like the UN. And I think, you know, the ideal, I'll go back to Aristotle, the ideal of an Aristotelian virtue is that it's one that you just embody and you see the benefit of it to yourself. And I think that's where we want to get to in the long run. Sometimes people don't see the benefit of it. They're blinded by assumptions about the other, whether that other be a religious tradition or an ethnic group or a race group. And their inability to see that peace would benefit us all, I think, is something that we want to kind of really continue to reinforce. We want to tell people, look, this will benefit you if we can kind of come up with a ceasefire. And if it means we have to put some troops on the ground to help reinforce that, we should do that. So again, Boutros Ghali was somebody that tried to do this without any benefit to himself. And, you know, he wanted the UN to succeed, but he's a good example of somebody that sought to do this. And I think other UN, I don't want to just focus on him, other UN Secretaries General, the UN system as a whole seeks to do this. So that would be my thought on that. Tough question. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Tony. I think we've got time for a couple more, if that's
okay
sure. With you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
So Fiona's written in and asked, my question really is a follow-on about the justice and peace, as justice also embraces economics and fairness. So does this not mean it's not just related to international law and the ICC? Speaking as someone who works for an NGO that calls for justice and peace. Any comments, please?
Yeah, that's terrific. And that's why I really like what Boutros Ghali tried to do, which is to say that you can't, he was very explicit in all his work that peace does not sit on its own. I mean, he tried to develop these new tools for peacekeeping, but he wanted to link it to development, and he wanted to link it to democracy and democratization. And he was really insistent that those are processes. They're not final outcomes. And, you know, this was something, and it was tricky for him as someone coming from the global South. And he acknowledges this in a number of places in his writing. where he says, so I'll use both development and democratization. Egypt, its economy is challenged. Its economic system is not perfect. It kind of liberalized in the 90s and the 2000s. Hasn't really lifted everybody out of poverty in the way, let's say, India and China has a much more successful attempt to lift people out of poverty. So I think that's something that he notes is complicated for countries from the global south. But he insists that you won't succeed unless you have social and economic equality and justice. And then democracy is even more complicated, right? Because he was, I think he recognized that Egypt was not a democracy in the way maybe that the other countries are. And he purposely called the agenda for democratization, because not democracy, because he didn't want it to be like this is an endpoint. It's a process. And he was very clear that we have to support initiatives to do this. We have to kind of develop it as much as we can. So I think that is something that I would completely agree with the question that we can't just have peacekeeping tools. It has to be a holistic approach. And the United Nations is a place where we could put these things together. Again, I'm focused on the UN here. There's other institutions that I'll talk about in the book, but I think that's really it's a great question, and I would completely agree. We need all those things to work together. Yeah.
Thank you. A couple of follow-up parts about that. You talked about the 5 members of the UN and having veto powers, and you mentioned countries like India not having that kind of place. Do you think there's ever going to be a situation where India could be, a member like those 5 others, and do you think that would ever be likely to happen?
Yeah, it's hard to see at this point, and there's been lots of proposals to develop to reform the UN Security Council in particular, which have included not just India, but countries like Brazil, South Africa, Egypt, in fact, others, countries that are very prominent in the international system, not at the level of the great powers. And sometimes that's seen as, it's the nuclear weapons club, the formal nuclear weapons club, because other countries have them too. Again, it's hard to see right now. I think what we need is people convincing those 5 permanent members to acknowledge and admit that the institution now doesn't necessarily reflect the international distribution of power. And that's where the realism comes in. So sometimes I think to myself, somebody should go up to Donald Trump. Of course, he likes to be complimented and say, you could change the whole UN. Here's a proposal. Why don't you make it your proposal and let's see what happens? You could see somebody convincing him within a matter of 5 minutes that this is a good idea and it's his idea. And then maybe he can then make it happen. So we want to take people and see if we can convince them of the benefits of changing the system. The other thing I'd say is right now, China is obviously a very important world power. China has a very different approach to international institutions. While it doesn't always follow what they say, it continues to kind of support them in a way that the U.S. currently, for instance, is not. So I think China is also a country where I think China and India have had their issues over the years. So going back to India, it might be difficult for them to agree to be together as permanent members of the Security Council. But I think China is also a country that could be convinced over time with diplomacy that a change is necessary, and we need to think creatively about how we can do that.
Okay. Great, thank you. I'm gonna try and squeeze in one last question,
Sure.
if I may, Tony.
Yeah.
Please. We definitely don't have time to get into this in huge detail that we'd want to, but can you give us your thoughts on what more the UN realistically could do to bring peace in the Middle East and between Russia and the Ukraine, please?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was looking today or a couple of days ago at what the UN Office of Peacekeeping and Political Affairs is now doing. And this might sound kind of ironic or problematic to some. One of the interesting things is the Palestinian cause is very much built into the UN system. So Palestinians are constantly mentioned and constantly discussed. As a result, in some ways, Israel has kind of removed itself from the UN and refuses to kind of connect with the UN in many ways. And that's unfortunate. And I'm not saying that the UN shouldn't be concerned about the Palestinian cause, because it absolutely should be. But there's a way that I think some more nuanced diplomacy needs to take place. First of all, in the institution, which could then lead to the good offices of the Secretary General being more effective in many ways. Ukraine, Russia, I think that's a complicated one, and that's a traditional land battle that's very different than many of the wars we've seen over the years. Could the UN play a role? I think the Secretary General should use his, or hopefully in the future her, good offices to try to create some sort of shuttle diplomacy between them. And I think if other powers like the US could encourage that, that would be even better. Again, I'm not in those positions, so I can't say exactly what that would look like, but that would be my hope for that to happen. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, Tony, thank you so much. I did say that was the last question, but I must ask this because I'm sure there's lots of people out there who would like to know. When's the book going to be ready to buy?
Well, unfortunately, not for a couple of years now. So I'm just at the beginning starting of it, but it'll eventually be there. I'll make sure and I'll spread it around the world. So yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Great, Tony. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this evening's talk. And thank you for taking the time to share your research with us. That's us coming towards the end of this event. So if you want to watch any of this back, you'll be able to find the recording on our YouTube channel. We'll put the link to our channel in the chat, where you can also watch previous Saints talks. Thanks again for joining us this evening, and please do keep an eye out for future Saints talks and events from development. Thanks and good evening.
Thank you.